sports, again, we can see maybe what's directly in front of us, but it seems like every day there's just a lot of unknown. So that's kind of the situation we're in right now. And a lot of the exploration and a lot of the discussion we're going to be having today is focused just on that, is what things are going to look like and how can we problem solve and be prepared for whatever may come next. Again, my name is Justin Goldman, also joined by Davis Turner. Our emails are here and available for you guys if you'd like to reach out to us at any time.
And that's one thing too, Justin, I just kind of want to reiterate is you'll find new information coming out every single day regarding returning to sport, whether it's, community-based programs or professional sports. There's something that comes up every single day. And just today, we found out the MLS, a lot of soccer leagues are having a lot of people test positive. And so are they going to delay their tournament? It's supposed to start July 8th, which is 6 days away, but yet they still have no kind of connection to that, or they have no kind of intentions of stopping or canceling the MLS tournament that's going to be happening. So it's really evolving at a very quick pace, and just to stay on top of it, it's a headache in its own mindset, or own right. But we just have to continue to do that. And I think that's one thing that is a little bit new and different is what are the safety precautions and how are those changing and what is going on that we need to adapt and evolve with. So making sure that we're always continually researching and looking for the best possible solutions moving forward is kind of how we're going to stay ahead of the game.
And just real quickly before we dive in, if you can't hear us for whatever reason, I know you won't be hearing this message, but this is just a slide to show you how to unmute your microphone if you are using built-in speakers. So we just wanted to share this with you guys real quick to make sure you can obviously hear us. If you're having any technical difficulties, again, that's what the chat room is for. So please feel free to reach out to myself or Davis, and we'll help you problem solve. The other thing we'd really appreciate is when we do go into breakout rooms, please turn your camera on. If possible, if you kind of have not the best internet, that's totally fine if you'd like to turn your camera off to make sure you have the best connection possible. So we're going to jump right in with a disruption event and really have you guys start to collaborate together in smaller groups and think about the current crisis that we are all involved in. Whether it's personally or it's just in your area, we're all dealing with, the pandemic in different ways. And what we want to do is use this as an opportunity to be creative and come up with new solutions for the problems that we're facing regarding sports. So we're going to jump into this into a breakout room where you have two options. You can kind of discuss with the other members in your group, and you can choose option A or option B. Option A is going to be where you will choose a sport that's been heavily impacted by COVID, whether that's European football or maybe it's basketball, soccer, any of those major sports. Then work with your group to adapt or change those rules so that it complies with CDC safety guidelines. Again, we know that the guidelines are constantly changing and they may depend on where you are located in the world, but don't worry about the total specifics. You don't have to be too in depth. Just be creative and enjoy this kind of creative opportunity to work with the other members in your group. And the other option that you have, option B, is to work with your group to come up with ideas for a new or reimagined team sport that could be played safely during this pandemic. So you can discuss some of the rules, how it would be structured, what equipment you might be needed, what might be needed. And that's why we kind of threw in this graphic from the infamous Calvin and Hobbes comic, because they always played this game called Calvin Ball. And Calvin Ball was literally a game where you made up the rules as you went along. And we thought it was kind of an appropriate comic to place here, because that's kind of the world we're in right now. We're trying to reimagine sports from the ground up because things have changed so drastically. So Davis is going to toss everyone into those breakout rooms, and you'll have 5 minutes to focus on either option.
We'll see you guys soon.
Okay, welcome back in, everyone. And we'd love to hear some of the conversation that took place in those small breakout rooms. So please feel free to share some of the thoughts and discussions that you guys had in the chat room, because we'd love to hear it. I know Davis and I have literally been talking about this topic for every single day since COVID kind of took away national sports back in March. especially March Madness. When that tournament got canceled, that was really tough for a lot of people and a lot of colleges. So hopefully the discussion was fruitful and that you guys had a chance to be creative and think about, new types of sports or new ways to change current sports so that they are safer for everyone involved. What we wanted to do now is just share a nice video that's a real quick overview, like a 10,000 foot overview of the current situation that we're dealing with right now.
Can they keep it up for the full 90 though? Hazard's ball, Erling Haaland's 1-0.
Around the world, the sports world is slowly beating back to life. Soccer in Germany with pumped-in crowd noise. Baseball in Korea with cutout spectators and fans literally in bubbles. And other leagues like the British Premiership and Italian Series A have actual firm start dates. In North America, it hasn't been as smooth. Health restrictions, testing issues, logistics, and the willingness of players have stalled efforts. In baseball, wealthy players don't appear ready to make salary concessions for even wealthier owners.
Our fans are telling us in overwhelming numbers that they want us to complete the season, if at all possible.
The NHL canceled its regular season, but announced plans for a 24-team playoff tournament. But still, no firm dates. The NBA has a plan, too, to complete its season at Disney World.
I think there's a good shot that it can happen, presuming that we're able to get tests. The tests are, accurate enough to meet the safety standards that the league and the Players Association set.
The NFL is the most confident, already releasing its 2020 schedule.
I think there definitely will be a football season this year. The real question is, will there be fans in the stadiums? I think right now today, we're planning on having fans in the stadiums.
Some experts wonder if all of these return-to-play scenarios are really worth it.
Even if you have that testing, okay, so one person comes down with the virus. The NHL is trying to create a public relations success here. Can you imagine the public relations nightmare if one of the players dies?
Drops the puck back, Petrangelo to the net, scores!
If North American leagues do resume, the games will undoubtedly look and feel different and be accompanied with more risk than ever before. Jamie Strachan, CBC News, Toronto.
Okay, so as you can see, there are a whole slew of things to really worry about and think about when we're looking at return to sports, whether it has to do with the financial impact, the economic impact, the social, emotional impact. These are all things that come into play, and that's what makes it such a multi-layered issue around the globe. So as we kind of continue our discussion, we do have a few objectives for this session, starting with just discussing the latest health and safety concerns affecting the return of youth sports. We're also going to observe what various national and professional sports programs have proposed to ensure safe returns. And then we're going to discover ways to reduce the pandemic's negative impact on coaches and athletes with a specific focus on social, emotional development and mental health. And then we're also going to share some resources throughout this discussion to help you develop safer playing environments and experiences for the athletes that you might be working with in your area. And again, that's why we really hope that you guys will lean on the chat room, because we all have different experiences. We're all living in different parts of the world. And those differences are what help us grow as a community and as a global family in terms of getting sports back to where they need to be.
And just so you're aware, before we even get kind of more in depth, we'll be sending out a list of resources and links to not only all the videos, but a lot of different articles and pieces that you guys can always refer back to and some of the work that we'll be doing today. So we'll have a recording as well as a bunch of resources from today's webinar.
Right. So don't worry if you miss some content or you're looking for, links to articles or videos that will all be provided for you. Some of the main concerns that we have when we look at, the return to sports is some are very obvious and others, again, may not be so obvious on the surface, but again, depending on the experience of the athlete, it is a main issue in terms of getting back to normal life. Reducing contact between players and team staff probably is one of the most obvious, whether it's through social distancing measures or you're looking at ways to change the rules so that players aren't as close as before. The testing protocols, especially with athletes that may not be showing symptoms but are still testing positive, there's a whole slew of various legal implications that have really delayed the return to sports because of possible, situations where a player can sue a league or something like that. The financial impact of just the sheer cost of providing those PPEs and the masks and everything else that's needed, hand sanitizer, the ability to constantly clean equipment and locker rooms. These all have a huge financial impact on sports organizations, especially at the youth level. Again, like we mentioned earlier, the social emotional factors like mental health, depression, anxiety, a lot of the other issues that young athletes are having, being separated from their best friends. This is a major implication when it comes to the overall health of athletes that are playing sports across the world. And then again, like we've always said, adjusting those rules almost on a daily basis to adhere with the newest CDC guidelines. Especially right now, this is an issue in the United States because we have seen certain states where the number of cases have really risen rapidly just in the past week. So everything that's been built up to this point is already being forced to change. And that ability to adapt and adjust on the fly is a main concern.
And I think, Justin and I had a conversation even just before we started this webinar a little bit of just how things are going to change even so drastically in the next 10 days, right? With the MLS beginning, and does that have an effect on the NBA? Does that have an effect on all the other youth leagues, right? This is a business for them, but not necessarily a business for your child or your athletes, right? It is their pleasure, is their way to get fit, is their way to, socially and emotionally evolve and grow as a person. But we also have to think about, is their safety worth it to save this, organization or this sport currently? There's always going to be sports, there's always going to be something, but we always have to kind of think of what that high level picture is, or that overview is, and what the real importance of sports are in a person's life. And not necessarily is it, at that top level where it's always thinking about the professional leagues and how they're doing things, but it's always a good way to kind of bring a sense of normalcy to our lives, but also relay that information to our younger generations.
And we see in the chat room, Catherine has a relative who's in high school softball and her life is extraordinary. I mean, she's depressed because that is her identity. And I think that's really important for everyone to understand. Whether you're a youth athlete or you're a professional athlete, you're a human being first. And that human element is what we really thrive on here at MSL Capita. And that's something that we try and express and we try and stress to all of the educators and the coaches that we work with, that the human element is extremely important. If you want to get the most out of your athletes, if you want to have success on the field or on the court, you have to be able to treat your athletes like human beings first. So I appreciate you, Catherine, sharing that. And I know we've heard tons and tons of stories of athletes that have really struggled during this time because their livelihood and their lives have been completely ripped out from underneath them almost overnight. And we talk about those concerns for athletes. We did mention a few of those, but we just wanted to list them for you here. And we'd also love for you to, again, use the chat room and mention any that you don't see listed here. I mean, again, we're kind of taking a 10,000 foot overhead view of the world as we know it, but because everyone's experience is different, there are going to be some things that maybe we haven't thought of or we'd like to discuss more with you guys. So physical and mental health obviously is paramount when it comes to the concerns for the athletes. The accessibility to just being able to go and train like we normally have in the past is a definite concern. We just found out yesterday, actually this morning, that the Denver Nuggets, the basketball team, their training facility closed because 2 players tested positive for COVID. So that's another issue where because 1 or 2 individuals came down with the sickness, that doesn't allow for anyone else in the organization to go out and practice. And now everyone on the team has to find a new solution for training right now. And they're a week away to going to Disney World to start up the NBA tournament. The financial and economic impact, again, these are all multi-layered, but every athlete's going to deal with that a little bit differently. And we get more into the economic impact and some of the inequity around the return to sports later on in this session. So if there's anything else that maybe we didn't list here you think is a real concern for athletes, we'd love to hear it and we can just continue that discussion. I see Shauna says community impact. I think that's an awesome one. That's a great comment. And definitely we've seen a lot of communities being impacted by the lack of return to sports or just all of these issues that the athletes and the coaching staffs are dealing with.
Well, I think that, and I think the idea of bringing people together, right? Like we have had such a hard time with that social emotional piece too, is it really affects not only the individuals and the families, but it really affects the communities, and bringing that community together, not only for fundraising, but charitable events and so on. But the sports are really a bonding experience for a lot of people. And I think, Shane, I think you're definitely hitting the nail on the head there, because it's not just on that individual level anymore. It is a larger case for that.
And next, we want to discuss some of the concerns for coaches. I think team chemistry and unity is a big one. I hear from coaches every day that just really miss that camaraderie and that chemistry that comes with being around your athletes and being able to motivate and mentor them on a daily basis. So just like the players are really struggling without that camaraderie and that chemistry, the coaches are feeling it as well, because they really thrive. Their happiness is really driven a lot by how they're able to impact and inspire their athletes on a daily basis. Obviously, this is one is a little bit more logistical, but just the travel concerns, dealing with safe, the cleaning of equipment, budgets for coaching staffs, and everything else that goes into being able to operate a sports organization or a team at the club level is also a concern. Then we put in here covering all the bases, which is really just the idea that you want to be as comprehensive as humanly possible when thinking about all these different aspects that come into play when it comes time to return. Let's face it, nobody has ever really dealt with anything like this before. So I think it becomes really overwhelming for the coaches, because they know that the players are looking up to them for the safety concerns and for, just feeling comfortable being back together. So I think that also places a lot of stress and anxiety on the coaches, because they have so many different things to think about and they have to take care of everyone. Again, physical and mental health. We talk about it a lot with our athletes, but the same holds true for the coaches as well. And that's another issue that we really have as a concern for coaches. And then the idea of continuing education and certification. For example, with USA Hockey, as a goaltending coach, I'm going to have to wait another year before I can get my level 3 certification. And that's going to hold me back a little bit as someone who's trying to, always improve as a goalie coach. And that's another thing that's happening all around the world on the national level. Because we're not able to come together, you can't bring coaches together, you can't hold these clinics. A lot of organizations have had to transition to online or virtual education programs, and that does take time, and that's really messing with a lot of schedules right now. So that's just another one of the concerns we have for coaches and coaching staffs.
And I think too, Justin, just to add on, is the fact that these coaches, they are people, and they're humans, right? A lot of times they're volunteers, and a lot of you out there are volunteers that want to do good for your community and want to do good for these athletes and these up and coming next generation students and scholars. So how can we really take that and be that shoulder to lean on? And a lot of times these athletes rely on us as coaches to be even more a part of their lives than their actual educators or teachers sometimes. And I know growing up, I had probably a handful of coaches that I related to a lot more during that time of my life than the teacher that was with me for 8 hours a day. So making sure that those connections are still happening, and not necessarily teaching the game or teaching the strategies of the game or the systematic thinking, but being there and being that relationship and being that kind of that team camaraderie that person is seeking at that time in their life. And that's one of those huge faults that this pandemic has really brought out is Zoom can only do so much, or those virtual meetings can only do so much for that team building and that bonding. And I think, Traveen, you made a big point here too, is these younger athletes, they don't have a say or choice, right? And sometimes we're forcing ourselves as coaches, or we're forcing the organization to move ahead because it's great for the child, but it's great for, their mental health, but not always their physical health. And so they don't have a voice, or they don't have a say in what that looks like in that return to sport. And I think that's a huge piece, is giving them that choice and that voice and that autonomy in order for these programs to move on. And I think that's where we look at, every stakeholder, and every stakeholder has that voice, and how do we give them that voice to say? And so we looked at some of the research that Aspen Institute has done along with Utah State and the North Carolina State University, and how they've done some research regarding the return. And parents have a huge push, and they have a huge stake in what happens in the return. So when we look at some of these statistics, it's overwhelming, right? 50% of parents fear that their child will get sick from playing and joining sports activities. That's unfathomable, right? Why would you put your child at risk in order to get sick or even be asymptomatic and jump into these organized sports just because, you know, the physical health piece is important as well? Yes, there are those cases where, you know, communities are less impacted, but there are communities that you don't know, right? And people are a little bit more, you know, I guess less restricted than they should be. And so that's why we've seen such a huge surge and spike recently too. And then 19% of parents said their children has completely lost interest in playing their sports during this shutdown. Over a span of 3 months, 4 months even, like they've completely lost interest. So almost 20%, 1 in 5 athletes will not be joining their sport again because they've lost interest during the shutdown. That's a dramatic decrease. And when we're looking at things like struggling to, you know, afford these organizations and afford these fee for play or, you know, pay for play sports, that just becomes even more of a burden. And so finding what that balance is going to be a significant barrier moving forward. And that's a huge economic push that we'll talk about a little bit more depth later on. And so when we look at some of that data, we also thought about, all right, if you're not prepared now to return, when would be the best time to return? And, you know, as we look at it, sports organizations, and I think to Trevine's point earlier, is sports organizations and the people making the decisions, they want to survive, right? They want to almost be there for these athletes, but also they don't want to collapse and kind of fall apart. And so they're pushing it to return a much faster rate than what parents and athletes are comfortable with. And you'll see on this graph, the blue is the sports organization's view of when people should return. This poll was done in May, at the middle to beginning of May. So it is a little skewed, but at the same time, the statistics hold true, right? We have to think about what parents are seeing and when they want to enroll their child in athletics again, in sports, but also what organizations are doing. And we'll talk about, you know, this huge community impact that these organizations have, but also what is the best route and how do we keep these organizations afloat, even if they're pushing towards reopening or reintroducing sports to the community. So as we kind of look through even more statistics, the same Morning Consult, who's using, you know, a lot of different things from North Carolina, we look at, you know, as we look at the data, there are so many different pieces that are involved in returning to sport, right? It's not just, are they healthy? Are they open, right? It's, you know, what those standards look like. What do those guidelines look like, and that the safety precautions that are going to be taking place within your organization or within the team locker room, whatever that is everybody going to get tested like they are in the professional level, right? Are they coming in every day? Are they, you know, taking questionnaires? Are they being able to, you know, is there a vaccine widely available? When do you feel safe coming back and returning? So there's a lot of these higher level questions that we still have to ask on a regular basis. And do we have access to that, right? And think about how we can afford these things, but also how can we make sure that it's equitable across the board. So, you know, if there's a youth team that's not traveling or not elite, are we giving them the same access to these tests as we are to these higher level travel teams or these elite teams that, you know, maybe cost more, but also are part of the same organization?
So really, it's just about having some confidence in being ready to push the start button at the right time and having all of your information and everyone in your organization or in your team on the same page. And there are, like Davis mentioned, so many things to consider as the sports world creates a new normal. And this video that we're going to play real quick is from the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And it's a really good, again, like very brief idea of all the different things that are being taken in consideration from the collegiate standpoint.
I think it's really important for parents and their children to understand that sports just is not going to look the same, I think, for for some period of time. And so some of that is helping young athletes, emotionally, mentally, physically, understand that this is not probably going to be the year that they had imagined. The measures that we're going to have to take to try and limit spread of COVID-19 is going to have to continue for some period of time. So that might mean, even though you're back training with your soccer team, it's not in the same way that you were used to before. So maybe in smaller groups, trying to keep physical distance, not having parents and other spectators at practice, and maybe there's games, maybe there's not games, or maybe competition also looks quite different because maybe there's changes in the rules, or there's limitations on traveling at all, or traveling very short distances to play teams that are within your community that are in a similar situation. Because certainly one of the main recommendations from the CDC is that people not be traveling large geographical distances and playing people in other communities where the situation with the pandemic may be quite different. So I think really talking with your children about managing expectations, not just for summer, but into the fall and maybe for this whole next year.
And I think that she brought up some really good points, especially about managing expectations. I think one of the things that we've learned about competitive youth sports is that it's always a race to be the most elite athlete and get that college scholarship. But now we're in a situation where we have to be patient and we almost have to let things unfold so that we can get a better grasp on what the new normal looks like. So I think this kind of rhetoric, what she shared with us here, is really important to be able to, explain this to the young athletes at any age, even all the way up to professional athletes that might be in their early to mid 20s, that have worked their whole lives to become pro athletes or to earn that collegiate scholarship. There are a lot of athletes that are in a rush and they're trying to force things back, and organizations and leagues are doing the same thing. But by being a little bit more patient and taking the time to really consider a lot of the different impacts and a lot of the concerns that we've been discussing so far, could save a lot of lives. And it could open the door for a lot of new opportunities as well. For example, when it comes to NCAA hockey, they used to travel all over the country to play their games in conference and out of conference. Now they're creating a new schedule for the 2020-21 season where it's all in conference. You're only playing teams that are geographically close to your college campus. And that's going to create new opportunities. It's also going to create new obstacles as well. And the challenge is to find a way to make the scheduling and the level of competition as equal as possible. So by rushing things back, you almost do more damage, but there's always going to be that pressure from everyone involved. Like David said, all the stakeholders feel that pressure to get back to normal because sports is a business at the youth and the professional level. So being able to manage the expectations with the athletes is paramount to making sure that everyone is healthy mentally and physically as well. And when we look at the road back, we captured this image from U.S. lacrosse. This is a good example of what their return to sport looks like on a national level for a national sport. And we really do have to keep in mind some of the things, some of the tools that are necessary for everyone to get back to that new normal. Some of the things that teams need is, again, mental health support for players and staff through things like teletherapy, which has become very normal now, virtual resources and different apps that can be used directly from the phone that has that direct impact on the athletes. All of the different tools, tech, and supplies that athletes need to train in isolation, whether it's from their makeshift home gym, or it's even using something like a VR headset to simulate a training experience. That's a great opportunity and something that teams really should be looking to invest in if they have the ability, because it will have a direct positive impact on those athletes. Virtual activities like watch parties, using the Netflix app, or even some note that team continue to build that bonding, even though these teams and these athletes aren't together. And again, we're going to ask the same question. What's needed in your area? What are some of the obstacles that you're facing when it comes to, making sure that the athletes are safe, happy, and healthy, and have the ability to stay patient by getting these training opportunities or these opportunities to at least, participate in some kind of exercise or some kind of challenge with their teammates, so that everyone is sticking together and everyone's getting through it as one cohesive unit. So we'd love to hear like maybe some of the things that you've leaned on, or some tools that you've used, or some tech that you've used in your area. Definitely feel free to share that in the chat room. And I see Catherine spoke about Sports Engine. That's awesome. That's a great resource. We see that with a lot of youth sports. And I think that's just one of the many tools that are available. And
Justin, to kind of jump into that too, is when we think about what teams really need too, is we have to think about equity, and how do we make these resources and these tools as equitable as possible to the students or the athletes that don't have access to VR headsets or home gyms or whatever. What can we do, and how can we provide them with the same resources that, you know, another athlete in the same team or the same district has access to? You know, what are those barriers that we need to do as coaches or administrators or educators to help broaden that? Can we create something? Can we be innovative in that light? You know, what is it that we can do to make sure that everybody has that same, I guess, that same starting line when it comes to access? And so that's a big deal when it comes to inequities across the board, right? You know, some students in the same, you know, even the same zip codes or district might have a completely different viewpoint and access to technology than somebody else. And so we just really have to think about what our team looks like, what the composition of, you know, socioeconomic status looks like, and relatively to internet access as well. So those are always things that we need to consider. And that's kind of where we lead to, is what has already been proposed for the return back, because that's what people are always seeking, is that return to normalcy. But we're not going to be back to normal anytime soon. And that's the biggest fear, is it's a fear of the unknown, but it's also a fear to change. And we really need to think about how we're going to change. It may even be the sport completely, or there might be even new guidelines that change the sport, you know, 5 years down the road. And these are those small things that really have to take into consideration over the long term. And so what has been proposed before with the CDC is, you know, there's always that transition period, right? What does testing look like? Are we going to be testing? Is that even fathomable, or is that even feasible with some of our groups, especially these community organizations that are, you know, not always the wealthiest? And how can we get access to testing on a cheap and relatively large scale level, and something that comes back pretty quickly? So what do locker rooms look like? You know, are they going to be utilized? They shouldn't, right? That's a close quarter situation. And I know in the NCAA and the football schedules, I know a lot of athletes they have a pathway that's forward. They can never return the same way that they came. And so they go through their screenings, they go to the locker room, get dressed, and they go right out. They cannot return to the locker room. They cannot return to get gear or anything that they've left in there. Everything is brought back out by, you know, medical professionals or people that are kind of in different layers. So then when they need to exit, they exit at different stages. So it's all kind of regimented into a kind of formula. And I think that's something that's completely new. But our locker room is going to be a thing of the past, right? Are we going to change the way we interact, you know, with the locker room? Are we going to get dressed or changed and do all those things in a different manner? And workouts need to be different as well. So if we're going to be in a small group, you know, what does that look like when we're working out? Can we use the same bench without it being wiped down? Can we, you know, exercise on the same equipment without wearing a mask? You know, are we wearing gloves during this time? You know, there's all these different precautions that we could take, but is it going to be the most feasible and fathomable piece that we bring forward? So when we disinfect and continually clean, we have to make sure that we're doing that routine every single day the same way. And that's a very hard thing, because we do get lax, and we're humans, right? We make mistakes and we forget about certain things, or, oh, I just did something, but I thought I did that, or I didn't do something, but I thought I did. And we get to that point where, you know, we get pretty lax on these ideas. And that's kind of where, you know, some of these openings have happened and why there's a big surge currently. When we think about, you know, the next steps of how do we actually treat and test, when athletes do return, I mean, this is from the JAMA clinic, which is a cardiology unit. And we kind of look at this as a toolkit, right? It's not going to be first and foremost. It's a sequence of events of, do you have symptoms? Do you not? Do you have, something that kind of balances you or shows you that you're asymptomatic? What does that look like? Because now recently, even though some people may have been asymptomatic, they were carriers and they were passing it on to other people, which they had no idea about. And so we just have to look at these different pathogens and all these different, pieces that may not always be at the forefront with a cough or a fever. Even though these are the most common symptoms, there's things that happen beyond that. And it's beyond our control because it is such a mystery in a lot of cases as well. So as we kind of use the professional leagues as almost an example, but definitely not the first and foremost kind of guideline, it's something that we can definitely learn and take from, right? And that's, even though Justin and I were kind of criticizing that the sports leagues are returning, even though it may not be safe, and a lot of athletes are opting out of returning. Especially in the PGA, you had 5 or 6 people just this last week drop out of a lot of the tournaments until things moved forward with, a vaccine or safety guidelines. And, a lot of people from, a team, I think it was even the WNBA has requested not to even play. And so there's a lot of these different aspects that we're not taking in consideration because of the professional leagues, it's considered a business, and that's strictly the business. And when we look at our youth sports and we look at, the professional leagues, we all want to be there. We all want to be professional athletes, but at the same time, they don't always take in consideration what's best for the athlete or what's best for the student and the child. And so thinking about some of the things that they're doing just to keep people safe or safer, even though they're putting them out in the playing field and maybe in harm's way in certain aspects, but we can always look at that, right? High touch surfaces are professionally cleaned at least 3 times a day. So that means that it's continually cleaned. Do we have access to that in our organizations, right? Do we have cleaners that are going to clean 3 times a day, very heavily used areas, right? Are there dedicated entrances that we can use to our, sporting facilities? And will everybody wear masks? Does everybody have access to a mask? Are there going to be, are we able to keep our social distancing rules in place? A lot of these people are still going to the locker rooms, and they have the space to sit 6 feet apart. Do we have that ability, right? How large is our space, and how often can we manipulate that space, or I guess separate the athletes enough to make sure that they do have that space? And are they going to be screened daily? We have athletes who aren't even screened now, and myself included, right? I don't show any symptoms, but who knows, right? I'm not screened daily, so I don't know if I've contracted, COVID-19 or not. But at the same time, we have to be able to replicate these things. We have to be able to replicate and scale these things to almost a science, to a point where everybody every single day is tested and given those kind of guidelines in that almost a decision tree, right? So then people are continued to be safe and are exposed to the right ideas. So when we look at the risks involved when we do return to sport, right? And this is done by the CDC and the Aspen Institute as well. They've put out kind of these guidelines of what it looks like, how that transition period would look, and where we find the most risk. And obviously we're going to be performing skills and drills by ourselves, alone, at home, with family around, however we've been doing it. And I know in the comments earlier, we kind of saw some people already talking that they're continuing training through Zoom, which is obviously the lowest risk. You're not going to get anything if you're still in your same sanctioned and quarantined environment that you have been in the past few months. So if we can resist any contact with the outside world, we're going to be in the best shape. And not necessarily mentally or physically, depending on our equipment, but we're going to eliminate that risk pretty significantly. But then you kind of go through those details. At the high risk, that's full competition between teams, right? And different geographic areas. And different geographic areas doesn't necessarily always mean from a city to a city or state to state. It could just mean across town even, right? Because there's a different impact, and a lot of people have different areas in which are impacted more, especially, I mean, we consider New York City for one, right? A lot of different parts of New York City were affected a lot higher rates than in different areas of New York or New York City and Manhattan and Brooklyn, where you think, hey, apartment buildings, right? You think about the levels of people living on top of each other and really close quarters in one building, elevators, stairwells, so on. How are you accessing your home, right? Whereas people in a single home, kind of a one family single residence, it's a lot different. And so we have to think about, even when we're traveling or even when we're participating with teams, can we make that a safe transition back, and what that looks like. So those kind of high risk, low risk pieces are a great way to really understand that balance and where we're going to fit in and how we transition to those more high risk environments, even though we have been exposed, or we have kind of seen our team a little bit differently in the upcoming months.
So now we're going to play another video that really focuses on that equity piece as well as the economic impact. And we've talked a lot, and we've probably seen in newspapers or social media or wherever you get your sports content, the impact business-wise on professional sports. But again, this also correlates to youth sports as well. And there's a whole bunch of economic issues that are really starting to pop up around the return to youth sports. And we shared that statistic earlier. Davis shared that great statistic that's also very alarming, that 50% of parents are not ready to bring their kids back to sport. And it's not just because of safety reasons either. It's also because they can't always afford it. And that's what this video will highlight here.
Now, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, many recreational youth leagues had to cancel their spring programs. But what are those leagues doing with the dues parents paid for their kids to play? 7 Action News reporter Brian Abel spoke with a Livonia family who says getting their money back apparently is not an option.
It was back in February that parents were paying to put their kids into programs like flag football. Then the pandemic hit and froze it all. And with social distancing requirements, touch sports like flag football, it's impossible. And parents are being told that what else is impossible is getting their money back.
That's the first time I've ever actually seen him excited to play a sport.
Livonia mother Julie Thompson paid about $200 for her 10-year-old fifth grader Christian spring flag football.
And that included his jersey, his mouth guard, all of that stuff.
Then COVID-19 hit. And it was all up in the air before the league was finally canceled.
They sent out an email and said that we had 2 options to get our money back, and it was really not getting our money back.
The options? After the equipment already sent, a $100 credit for a future program, or donate it to a scholarship fund. Neither of which Thompson wanted to do.
I understand they have a business to run, but I have a child to raise, and I would like to get the money back. He is not going to be playing next year.
Thompson isn't alone, with posts like this popping up on Facebook saying they haven't been able to get in touch with National Flag Football. We called, and the executive director tells us a diluted staff of 12 is working to assist the families of the 27,000 kids across the country affected by the cancellation. No one's dealt with something like this before, and they say they're doing the best they can. And though only a small percentage aren't satisfied with the 2 options, that still leaves thousands of families waiting for answers and their money.
I get it. It was the pandemic. None of us saw this coming, but you have to do what's right.
And Thompson says that she is going through her bank to dispute the charges. We've put her in touch with the executive director, who says that they are working with families on an individual basis to give refunds and find an amicable solution. For 7 Action News, I'm Brian Abel.
Well, at least a solution is coming. Thanks, Brian.
So as you can see, there's a whole slew of implications there that's going to impact the way that youth sports, the future of youth sports. If families can't afford to pay for kids to come back because they haven't gotten their money back from the season before, you can see how that's a really touchy subject and a touchy issue for a lot of youth leagues. And youth leagues as well rely on sponsorships from other organizations.
Due to the COVID-19 pandemic,
youth leagues really rely on sponsorship from corporations and from local businesses. And if the local businesses are being impacted by the coronavirus, that's also going to impact the amount of money that the youth organizations have for their sport to continue running. So it's this trickle down effect all the way from the top of the sports food chain all the way down to those grassroots associations. And unfortunately, those grassroots associations seem to be being impacted the most because, again, $200 to pay for a flag football team, if you're not getting that $200 back, the parents have to weigh the pros and cons, especially if they're dealing with, being furloughed or not having the ability to work during this time. That's a huge economic factor that's really having a big impact on youth sports.
And you'll notice some of the statistics we put on this page, they're pretty staggering, right? The idea that if we're in a situation that we're, really trying to conserve our money and our kind of financials, I think, sports are the ones that kind of suffer in our child's life, and we can't really future-proof that until we're future-proofed ourselves and are stable and well off. And so we have to really consider what that looks like. And so that's why, half of families can't take that financial burden of returning to sports and thinking like, oh, well, if I'm not ready, if my job looks a little iffy, and with so many people being unemployed and being laid off or furloughed, it becomes a drastic measurement and a big decision for that family in general. So a lot of people are not enrolling in sports currently because of that financial barrier. And you'll see, like Justin was kind of mentioning before, it's half of these sports organizations aren't going to last, right? Like they foresee, possible closures because 38% of them are on the brink of closing within 3 months. And now it's July. So if we're already, 3 or 4 months into this pandemic, a lot of these sports organizations are really suffering. And how do we get beyond that? And how do we get, to a point where, we feel comfortable enough to support these organizations financially as a family, but then safety, right? Are we just going to, donate to them just because? A lot of times people have, but at the same time, do we worry about the safety of our family first and foremost? So, and that's where a lot of parents are kind of conflicted. And you'll see on the slide now that's currently up is over the last few years, sports organizations have really increased fees, and it's the cost to play and the fee for play is increasing dramatically each and every year, and it's almost pushing people out of sports. The average family is spending between $100 to $500 a month, right? That's a lot of money, and that's significant chunk of change depending on groceries and whatnot. But these are basic youth sports organizations that are pushing these children to be funded, at least $100 a month, and that's $1,200 a year for beyond just maybe the registration fees or whatever that looks like. And so it's a significant piece where a lot of these organizations are having to really understand where that money is issued and how they're funding and they're budgeting their funds. And so when we look at the kind of the quote that we put up there, obviously it makes sense, right? But then from a sports and a business side of things, it's completely different, and it's a complete opposite spectrum. I need a job too, and I need this to happen. So if they're going to open, it's putting other people at risk, but also their families and their organizations as well. So it's kind of like a double-edged sword here, but at the same time, we still need to focus on the safety of our athletes and our children.
So what we're going to do now is we're actually going to have a quick exercise, and we're going to use a program called Mentimeter. What Davis is going to do, he's going to share a link in the chat room, and what we'd like everyone to do is just click on that link, and it's going to pull up a slide. And the question is, what is your biggest or most pressing concern regarding the return of youth sports? And you don't have to just give 1 or 2 word answer. You can give a full-fledged answer, and we would love to see some of the results, and I'm going to share the results in just a few minutes. So you can click on the link that Davis provided, and then we'll just take just a couple of minutes for you guys to answer, and I will pull up the results. You can also go to menti.com, and then you can enter the code 656327. So go ahead and take a few minutes just to type in your answer, and I will pull up the results. And I'll just share a few of these. I know you guys can see it, but we have one answer: the mental health of the kids. Sports is very important to many students. that's an appropriate answer to read off because that's actually what we're going to focus on next. What if fall sports gets canceled altogether? I think that's one of the biggest concerns is if sports are canceled altogether, it's really going to have an even more dire impact on the whole economy and the whole society of youth sports. Biggest concern is the health of the athlete and the psychological development of each student and athlete. I think this is a really good concern, children catching COVID and spreading it to adults, because we know that lots of children may be asymptomatic, but that doesn't mean that they're not necessarily carriers either. So if they are carriers and they're spending a lot of time around older individuals, that could impact things. The advantages of competing, that's a huge one. Competition is what drives every single athlete that plays at a high level. And without that competition, that's why the depression and the anxiety and the frustration has reached an all new high. The attrition rate of participation in sports, that's a huge one. I see Davis shaking his head. I know that's where he's focused a lot of his energy on, is just the impact it's going to have in sports participation and the overall health of, youth societies around the world. And the last one I'll read off here is the number of students who will be returning or who may be permitted to return because of the parents' choice. I think the video that we just shared and some of the stuff that Davis shared really touched on that as well. And the interest of athletes in the new normal, that's 100%. These are all like major concerns. These are some great answers. So I really appreciate you guys taking the time to share some of your thoughts. And every single one, what's so interesting about this whole thing and why it's so fascinating to just observe is the fact that they're all interwoven. Everything is connected. And again, you go all the way to the top with professional leagues like the NBA, and Davis mentioned how 4 or 5 PGA Tour golfers stepped back and decided not to. Everyone's got really tough decisions to make surrounding this situation. So again, that's awesome. Thank you guys so much for sharing some of those comments. We're big fans of Mentimeter. It's a great interactive tool to use in sessions like this. So as we move forward here and we start to discuss the social emotional factors, I know we've touched on this throughout the session, but we really wanted to focus in on some key statistics that hammers home just the importance of, sports organizations and coaches, educators, every single one of us doing what we can to help support athletes that are struggling with this situation. ASU's Global Sports Institute revealed that 72% of parents, 72%, said that the inability to play sports these past few months has caused their child stress or anxiety. That's an alarming percentage, okay? And as a hockey player myself and someone that thrives on that ability to go out and skate and compete and be with my buddies, I am not afraid to admit that I've been dealing with stress, anxiety, a little bit of depression, just all these different, the wave of emotions that you go through when something that you truly love and has been a part of your life for so long is ripped out from underneath you. So being able to talk about it is really important. And I think that's something that, again, we can all participate and be active participants in shifting the culture towards a more open and understanding world. 92% of families listed sports as the primary source of physical activity for their children. And 85% listed sports as a key way for their kids to make friends. So again, it's not just about the competition side, and it's not just about the physical activity either. It's the fact that this is how kids build relationships. This is how kids learn really important skills that are going to serve them for the rest of their life. We try to instill respect and empathy, these really important soft skills, and that's what sports provides for us. And when we don't have that, the kids need to find another outlet to develop those skills. So athletes really do need to stay connected to their peers, which will help them overcome the identity crisis that they're currently dealing with that limited social life.
And I think Timothy made a comment in the chat section earlier that really related to, high school sports and the effect on each individual. And you remember, I remember my high school sports, and I remember participating in front of our friends and participating with my friends, and choosing to play school sport rather than a club sport, at the time, because I was so close to different people and how I wanted to participate. And so, that has such an important factor in not only your personal growth, but how you interact with your peers and how you make friends and how you want to continue that connection on a deeper level by playing sport. And so I think that's where we bring in together all these different social and emotional pieces, but thinking about those memories and thinking about, the intrinsic motivation that drives us. And is it those extrinsic pieces that are peers or acceptance, or is it that internal drive that for connection? It's those things that we really have to kind of disseminate and within ourselves of why are we doing the things that we do. And I think that's a huge piece of that social emotional aspect as well.
Mm-hmm. And there are so many great ways that you can keep athletes and teams connected during this time. And we listed a few here, and we're also going to be providing you afterwards with a blog that lists even more activities and more ways that you can lean on technology to help athletes and young kids stay connected. So we won't spend too much time going through those now, just because we're going to be providing them for you with the toolkit. But again, we just wanted to list a few. And I think it's really important too, to always try and find that silver lining with a situation like this. And one of the things that Davis and I have discussed is just the fact that this is an opportunity to try new activities, sports, and hobbies. I'm going to go out and try mountain biking next weekend during our vacation in Breckenridge. I know Davis has had a chance to get out a little bit as well and try some new things. And we've also really become very interested in esports and gaming, because we've seen the numbers skyrocket since COVID started to take over the world, that, kids still find ways to stay connected and have great conversations and build friendships virtually and online through gaming. So I think that's a really valuable asset to have right now. Whereas maybe, less than a year ago, a lot of families and a lot of parents and a lot of teachers and educators looked at esports and gaming as a negative thing, as something that, took kids away from what they should be doing and really, developed some bad habits. But the tune has completely changed. I talk to parents almost every single day that say, oh my gosh, thank goodness for gaming. Thank goodness for esports right now, because my kid can still get on the headset and talk to buddies all over the world and enjoy being together by playing games. And so that's an asset right now. And I think that's something to really keep in mind as we try to keep athletes and kids connected right now. And it's also important, I think, that we realize that mental health truly does matter. We kind of premised this entire spotlight by saying that athletes are human beings first. And we really want to emphasize that, especially in a situation like now. A lot of people have, had discussions openly with myself about the fact that maybe they never experienced, anxiety or depression before. But because of this COVID situation, they're experiencing it for the first time. So they're becoming more empathetic with what a lot of athletes have dealt with every single day. We know that mental health is a major issue in youth and professional sports. And we're starting to see more stories come out every single day, every single month, from high-profile athletes that are opening up and being honest about the different obstacles that they face when it comes to, mental health and illness. And now it's become exponential, but at least we're in a situation where we're starting to see a lot of the stigmas get shed and get reduced, because we all know the importance of just being able to listen. When a young athlete comes to you and you can tell that they're frustrated or they're concerned or they're worried, what a great opportunity to just be there to listen to the issues that they're dealing with and help them understand that it's okay to not be okay. That's one of the best phrases that we can use, whether you have mental health experience or you're a coach, no matter who you are, using phrases like it's okay to not be okay and you're not alone goes such a long way. And so it's really important to remember that if you see a kid that's struggling and may not be, the most comfortable opening up, there are all kinds of different tools, and we will provide some for you again in that online toolkit after this session, so that you do have access to some of these mental health resources that are being used every single day, whether it is, a 1-800-suicide hotline, or the Anxiety and Depression Association of America, which I use often when I'm working with young goalies that are struggling. And then again, just being able to use all the great free mobile apps that you can find in an app store, like Worrybox and Calm. things that are going to emphasize and promote that mindfulness and the ability to manage their anxiety is extremely important right now. So that's something we really wanted to emphasize during this session, because again, you don't have to be a sports psychologist, you don't have to be a mental health expert to be an advocate for mental health and to be there to hear a lot of the issues and concerns that young athletes may be having.
I think a lot of it, yeah, it has to do with that social connection piece, like Justin was saying. It's and I think Luke mentioned it too in the kind of chat in an indirect way. It's how we relate to people, right? We get so caught up with, the conversations that we have very minimally, even though it might, be something that's just through Zoom or, a once a day thing. But then we continue to think about that and almost, spiral out of control with our thoughts of like, what do they mean by that? What did they, how do I interpret this? And so, I just had a conversation the other day with a colleague, and I thought about it for a week and a half, even though I could have easily called them up and say, I felt really weird about this conversation. Can we talk about it? But no, I just started spiraling, and I started thinking about the most negative scenarios I possibly could. And that's the case that we're all living in, right? We don't have the access to go and see somebody in person and read their body language, or, get those affirmations or that feedback directly. It is all done indirectly, and sometimes through, text or chat or whatever, and things get, misconstrued. And we have to really understand that communication and opening up with those lines of communication is a significant factor in everybody's life, no matter, youth, child, or adult, or coach. We just have to think about those types of communication, how we can really get those across. And I think that's where we see those staggering statistics. It's very detrimental to our children's health and to our health especially. And so we think about the next stat that's on the second bullet point here is, even though we talk about childhood obesity quite often, without the pandemic going on, it's definitely 10 times higher than it has been, or it was in 1975, which is, a staggering number in itself. But how are we really interpreting, and how are we really leveraging the ideas of communication online too, right? We talk about screen time, but yet now here we are all in front of the Zoom meeting because we can't be in person. And we're having Zoom meetings one after another, and we're still learning, but we're still also taking the time to be on the screen. And so how do we remove ourselves from that? We really need to sometimes take a step back from the technology and take a step back from, the screen or whatever, to really find time for ourselves and find how we can really move beyond just esports or just our own internal conversations, and play individual sports, because that competition, that intrinsic motivation, is what really needs to be pushed in these times of crisis as well. And so I think that kind of leads us directly to, when we are pushing ourselves, what does that look like, right? We have a lot of studies now based off of, the time that we've spent in our COVID quarantines, that, we see the staggering numbers of the inequities that happen, right? 20% of Black and Hispanic workers have positions where they can't work from home. And what happens to those children? What happens to their food? What happens to their transportation? What happens to, their parents if they're the frontline workers that are considered essential and are gone all day, right? How are they going to have the same access as a child that has home gym, has technology, or has internet access, or has a computer, or whatever that is, or a healthy meal? Those are all different things in talking about equality and equity that we have to really start understanding and breaking down, because there is such an inequity within sports organizations, or even youth sports organizations put on by cities. Some people are sponsored and give free community events or services that deal with sports, and some are pay to play. And we really have to find out what the best cost and benefit model is to really move forward with our next organization, our kind of next steps throughout this. So we look at 62% of their child's activity, 62% of their child's activity has decreased a little or a lot during this pandemic. And this is happening through those 69% of their parents said that their child is focusing on improving their fitness. But it's on a completely different level for income, right? So people that made over $150,000 or more, 62% of their child said that their fitness at home is increasing. But then only 37%, almost half with income of $50,000 or more. So income definitely dictates, based off of this survey, income is definitely a dictator in how much fitness and how much exercise somebody's getting and how much access to technology or to Zoom fitness apps or to Zoom calls with their coaches, right? It's definitely something that we have to consider when we're trying to build an equitable result to this pandemic. Not everybody has access at the same time to a computer. Not everybody has access to the internet or a healthy meal or home gyms or even a field or a playing field. If you live in an apartment, you may have to walk somewhere, and do you have, a phone to take with you, or how's the safety concerns there? So there's a lot of things that we really need to consider when it comes to planning our next step for our organization or our athletes moving forward. And so we look at even, something before COVID. How did that look? How did those sports look? And we see, only 39% of high school students participate in sports. You can see the distinct areas where, high poverty schools are 2 times less likely to offer sports than low poverty schools. And it all has to do, like I'm guessing, to do with access, right? Like what can we provide our students? And it's not due to the lack of desire that people want to play sports. It's, how can we offer these things as a different option to, after school activities? What are they getting into otherwise? And how can we really provide them with a more holistic, growth kind of pattern or trajectory? Because we all know that, being involved in sport has led to increases in test scores and an increase into academic kind of success. So we really need to really focus on what that looks like and where budgets are going, because as we know, I think in one of the slides coming up, we talk a little bit about, reopening schools and what that looks like and where the budgets are coming from. And so as on average, we were kind of researching and things. So on average, a school is going to take about $1.2 million to open up in a safe and effective way. And so where is that budget going to come from? And a lot of times it's been proposed that it's being taken out of athletic departments or special needs and special services departments, in which is, I understand that those are tough decisions that have to be made, but it's a scary choice that you're going to see. And, those revelations really are going to come true in the fall when we're trying to reprogram and kind of utilize what blended school looks like, or where things are kind of dictated. So we had this kind of video from the New York Times. Again, it's an opinion piece, and it's an opinion thing that New York Times put out, but it really shows the transferability into what we could do and what we could possibly learn from the NBA and their type of kind of equitable model. So I'll let Justin hit play, and then we can kind of discuss it in a second.
The United States is one of the most unequal countries in the developed world. People who aren't wealthy have less chance of success and less chance for their children to succeed. When you talk about fixing these things, though, people freak out. Taxing the rich, helping the poor, to many Americans, that smells like socialism. But there's one part of American society that has been successfully fighting inequality for years, and right under our noses, because they know just how important it is to make sure everyone gets a fair chance. That's right, I'm talking about the National Basketball Association. See, in the NBA, there are rich teams and poor teams. The New York Knicks, the Los Angeles Lakers, and other big city teams charge more for tickets, sell more merchandise, and strike bigger broadcasting deals. They're rolling in money. Meanwhile, the Phoenix Suns and Minnesota Timberwolves are struggling to get by. Now, you may be thinking, great, that's competition for you. Let the best team win, right? Well, no. The NBA wants competition on the court. But to maintain that competition and make sure every team has a fighting chance, the NBA imposes strict rules to limit competition everywhere else. Let's take a look. Rule 1, revenue sharing. The NBA makes about $2.6 billion every year from national television deals, but that money is divided evenly among the teams, regardless of how many viewers each team attracts. Popular teams, which bring in huge audiences, are actually giving up some of their earnings to help out teams that are less profitable. Rule 2, spending limits. There's this thing called the salary cap. It's a limit on how much each team can spend on players. Last year, it was about $110 million, and every team has to stay under that limit. So instead of a no-holds-barred free market, the NBA is actually stepping in to make sure the wealthy teams don't always outbid everyone else. And that means poor teams can make competitive salary offers to top players. Rule 3, the draft. New players enter the NBA through a draft. But how do you decide who gets first dibs on the hot talent? Well, it's not random. The NBA awards those precious top draft picks to the worst teams. That's right. Each season's worst teams are actually rewarded for their failures by getting a better chance at the top pick. And that gives them a head start on building a better team for next season. So why does the NBA do all this? Simply put, they know that unregulated competition would be a disaster. The rich teams would use their mountains of cash to buy up all the best players, and soon they'd have a chokehold on the league. You'd start to see the same few teams in the championship every year. Lakers, Bulls, Knicks, Lakers, Bulls, Knicks. Just imagine the Knicks. It would be a lot like the rest of America, where the wealthiest people can set their kids up with trust funds while everyone else struggles just to pay the rent. But maybe you're wondering, why do rich teams agree to share their hard-earned profits with their poorer rivals? Well, the answer is simple. The Lakers need other teams to play. Good teams. Otherwise, what's the point? The only reason fans show up for basketball is because we believe it's a fair fight. We need to know that with enough talent, hard work, and good old-fashioned luck, any team has a chance at the championship. Without that level playing field, it would be boring as hell and bad business for the NBA. And here's the thing. A level playing field would be good for the rest of us too.
So if you think about, some of those kind of nuances that they brought up, it's, how can we really make a more equitable kind of baseline? And I know of an organization out in Virginia who has merged two different communities, one with, considered a higher socioeconomic status and one with lower. And some of the lower socioeconomic status had better athletes, but they didn't have the funds or access that the, higher socioeconomic status is. They merged their communities and their community organizations into one larger kind of regional organization. And so instead of just having two separate cities that, were kind of fighting for the better talent and the better players, they merged them to create a more kind of equitable foundation for their organization. And I think it gives way to a lot of, competition and also a lot of conversations about what needs to be done in order to make sure that everybody is getting the same access. And that's kind of what we look at when we're talking about the community versus school sports and how that looks, right? We have the easy ability to do that. I wouldn't say easy, sorry, but a different ability to do that within a community organization than we do with school sports. And so how do we make that more accessible? And what does that look like, right? Can we put sports in the middle of a school day, since we know how it increases academic scores? Can we really rearrange the hours of the day much like the NCAA schedule that kind of perpetuates the idea of when you go to college and you're participating as a student athlete, you have a class dedicated to that sport. So when I was in college at Western Michigan University, I played hockey, and I was able to take 2 hours for that course in the middle of each day to practice. And that was that team, and that was a single credit. Can we do that for our young student athletes as well? And how does that play out? And for even other alternative, other community events or after school activities or typical after school activities, as in theater or different clubs or, esports or whatever that looks like. How can we integrate that throughout the day? And we really need to kind of find a good balance and making sure that the focus continues to be on the learning aspect of these sports and the fundamentals, and rather than just the winning aspect of these inter-squad practices we could have, rather than traveling to city to compete continuously. So competing within oneself or within one's systems to make each and every one of us within that system better can lead way to a lot of different innovations and a lot of different perspectives as well.
I think just like Davis said, we're seeing this shift in the culture of youth sports and the way that we really approach, individual development, and then come together to have that team camaraderie and then the team competition. We realize that technology really matters, and next gen athletes, especially Generation Z, are growing up with this massive wave of new technology that does have a little bit of inequity, but at the same time, there is more accessibility. There are ways that that a lot of different people can gain access to, just basic tech like wearables. Wearables has become a multi-billion-dollar industry just over the past 5 years. And every month we're seeing new products come out that athletes can use and youth can use to take advantage of some of the opportunities of being able to improve their sport or stay active without having to be in that team environment or that traditional environment. So again, just wanted to list a few here. We tossed in this photo of this mock-up of a new type of helmet that would include, a PPE mask. And so again, we're seeing just this awesome wave of new ideas, new opportunities, new technology that can have a positive impact on a lot of the situations and a lot of the concerns that we've been discussing throughout this spotlight. So again, it's really important to keep in mind that while there is this sort of sense of doomsday when it comes to youth sports, on the flip side, there is so much opportunity and so much new technology, new creative ideas. Great new jobs are emerging out of everything that's happening. And again, you may not hear about it all the time because the media tends to be a little bit biased towards, the scary things that are going on in the world. All you have to do is take a look at some of that new tech that's emerging, some of the new products and ideas that are coming out of this situation, and it will have a positive impact and bring more equity and more accessibility to sports and training development.
Right, and I think to that same point is it's pushing us to be more creative, and it's pushing us to be more innovative and think about things in a little different ways, because we can't take advantage of what we did before. We can't leverage what we did before because we relied and kind of almost took it for granted. So how can we continue to push our athletes, not necessarily in the same team sport, even though we hope for that return to normalcy and we hope that our sport continues because we have that passion for it. But sometimes we have to put our ego aside and say, try something else. We always want to promote multi-sport athletes, and we always want to promote, the athletic and the wellness of a child. So try archery, try running or hiking or esports or volunteering or something to do with entrepreneurship. What is it, another passion that you could follow? Expose them to different things that maybe within the sport, but are still on a different pathway that they can do individually in a little bit safer manner, because we know that football may not return, soccer may not return, and all those different things. So that's kind of where we're going to kind of push our next step and kind of design our next experience for you guys. Is you guys are going to jump into breakout rooms again here in a second, and we're going to kind of set you guys up with a little graphic organizer template. And this is for you guys to keep and use and leverage however you wish. But it's almost just like a timeline, right? What are those phases that you're going to create? How are you going to create them? And how are you going to kind of think about those unconscious biases that you may have or your organization might already have systematically, and move on from that and change the pathway and get a return to play in a safe and effective way? And thinking of all the stakeholders, how are you going to communicate? What are those things that we talked about before that are really going to set you up for success moving forward? So I attached some links to a Google Doc as well, and it's already just a copy. So just say make a copy on that first link. And then if you're more partial to Microsoft Word, there's a second link that you'll just have to download and use it. We're going to ask a brave soul in your breakout rooms to jump in and kind of share their screen. and kind of take some notes and write down your kind of ideas. And then we'll share out when you guys return. So Justin, do you have anything to add on?
Nope, just the graphic organizer is pretty straightforward. You're just going to be, you know, ruminating on different phases and some of the different rules that you would use in that return to play experience. But if you have any questions, just reach out to us in the chat room. You're not going to have 12 minutes, by the way. We're going to cut this down to 5 minutes just for time purposes. But we will reconvene as soon as that's over so we can wrap things up.
And it might be a little bit shorter just because we are running low on time, but we'll go as fast as we can, and hopefully you guys can get some good conversation going. All right, see you in a second. Welcome back, everybody. Sorry we had to rush that a little bit. I know you guys are very quick on time, so we're going to kind of quickly go through these last few slides just to kind of wrap up here in a second. As you kind of probably talked about and noticed is, you know, just what this new starting line looks like, right? What are those reentry plans and how can we really make a difference? So when you're really looking at it and taking this graphic organizer, this template that we kind of provided you, please use it within your organization, use it however you see fit. It's just something that it's a tangible or, you know, pathway that's kind of just a brainstorming piece, right? And I know you and some organizations have probably already started working on something similar, but it's just another way to visualize something or even communicate new ideas. But really, when you're looking at this, you want to take a comprehensive look and an unbiased piece. And I know when you kind of mentioned this in your comment, it's the idea of some of these policies we're being forced into and some of them we're not. And how do we really adapt to that? And how do we really take advantage of what's available to us? And we really need to find that baseline. And then rethink your systems and operating models. How can we figure out and focus on equality and equity across the board, right? Be honest with your values as an organization and really put them into action, as well as lean into empathy. And I think that's the biggest thing, is how do we really focus on who we're serving and not just being available for our business and not just being available for sport. It's who are the communities and who are the people that we're actually serving, and listen to your stakeholders and listen to the athletes, listen to the families and what they're going through and how can we best serve them. And that's really the dedicated piece, is we need to make those changes and make those changes for the long-term sustainability, right? We need to be able to listen to our clients and listen to our people that are participating, because we're working for them essentially. And that's really that biggest push that I'm pushing you guys on, is really understand that communication is very key, and we need to make sure that that's clear and continuous throughout to all stakeholders and why you're doing what you're doing. And make sure that you create that flexibility in all aspects of your organization. We don't know what's going to happen next. And that's why, you know, even news this morning changed some of our conversations that we're having today, is because we have to be flexible. We have to understand that this is still an evolving situation that we can't really tie down. And even though we always expect clear-cut, frequent answers, it hasn't been that way, and it's not going to be that way anytime soon. So we just really need to focus on what we can control and be able to control that. And so as we kind of move forward, you know, going forward, we have a lot of different topics that we want to discuss with you, and a lot of it revolves around similar topics. So we have a series coming up that's really focused on mental performance and mental health. So please join us for that, and how we can really enhance that. And that's kind of really the point of contention is when we're during this pandemic, how do we really approach that, and what that looks like moving forward, even as we start blending our traditional sports and our traditional lives back into, you know, our quarantine lives. So what does that look like, and how can we really make an impact there? And so please join us for the July 29th and August 5th for both of those events. And then almost along the same lines is, how do we have that team building aspect? August 15th and August 16th is the weekend, but it's kind of focused on that retreat type style of team building in this new normal, as well as where are we going to be doing this, and how are we going to be doing this when we don't have access or we're not seeing each other in person on a regular basis. So what does that look like?